So for our next section, what we thought we'd do is we'd break it up a little bit. We've had a couple of demos of the wicked things that we're doing in Australia. What we thought we would pivot to is more of an open Q&A style thing with a couple of our strategy leaders and our AI leaders in the practice. So I'm joined today by Kelly Nuttall, who leads our strategy and business design practice and is a partner within the firm, and Alon Ellis, who in our recent thought leadership, it's also called Elon Allen accidentally, but his name is definitely Alon Ellis, who is also a partner in our strategy and business design practice. So we're going to have a bit of an informal chat, slow things down a little bit for the next half an hour. If you have any questions, hey, this is an interactive session, pop them into the Q&A and we can answer them live. But before we kick into the questions, can we do a mic check, considering we've had a few little stumbles already today?
Mic check 1, 2.
Hello, hello.
Awesome. Okay, let's get crack-a-lacking. All right, so the first question I reckon I'll throw to you, Kel. So we talk a lot about Deloitte about being an AI-fueled organization, but what do we mean when we use the term AI-fueled organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think AIfuelled is kind of like the evolution of being a data-driven organization, and where data has traditionally been used to generate insights to make better decision, and becoming data-driven is like that's informing all of your decision-making across the business. AI is a little bit different. It's still about generating insights from those technologies, but sometimes it's also embedding them into core processes so that they're actually streamlining the efficiency of the organization, or even, you know, underpinning new product offerings like what we just saw in two of the last demos, right? So it is about the insights, but sometimes it's also about embedding it into workflows. And so an AI-fueled organization is an organization that actually thinks about where AI can, you know, deliver value, and it embeds it not only just into the insight generation, but also processes, into workflows, into, like I just said, new offerings like cognitive agents, which we've heard about from Brazil before. So yeah, it's about also not just thinking about the use of these technologies in silos, it's thinking about it being a core capability, and Alon, you'll talk about this much better than I will, a core capability to achieve the business strategic objectives. So AI-fueled is a capability to unlock your strategy, not just AI in isolation.
Yeah, it feels like there's like this spectrum of, you know, a few years ago people were just looking at decisions that they would have made previously using a bit gut feel and being a little bit more scientific. But the exciting thing when you talk AI-fueled is something I couldn't have created before. And there's lots of really good examples coming out now, but that's where it's all heading, right? It's doing things either at a cost level that was just completely impossible before, or actually creating new services. And that to me is the most exciting bit, right? You're actually creating a new product and a service that was previously either unthinkable or, you know, ridiculously uneconomical. But then with AI now, particularly generative AI, like these things are possible, and also the cost of the innovation is completely plummeted. Like looking at James's presentation before, computer vision used to be incredibly hard, not super accurate, and very, very expensive. And now you've completely flipped it, and there's all of these you know, pre-built models and enhancements, and just a way of tapping into that cost of innovation. Sorry, the drop in the cost of innovation, tapping into that capability that is just completely different.
And I think just to add to that too, like AI-fueled, if you think about an Amazon or, you know, a Uber, like they've used AI to, you know, take a market or, you know, make it a more seamless experience for customers using AI, you know, to absolutely fuel that whole process. But then they look at how they scale it to another offering. So, you know, Uber uses great optimization, customer experience, supply demand matching algorithms to take a market from taxis. It used the same platform, the same foundations to then create a new market in Uber Eats. So becoming AI-fueled is really about that enterprise view and the common data foundations that are going to unlock AI across your whole organization. And so what we see in Australia particularly, and, you know, even more broadly globally, is organizations often start their AI journey in silos because they don't have an enterprise view of it. They start running at it in a pocket of the business. And in the absence of an enterprise strategy, you've already got pockets of AI happening. That is impossible to then actually unlock an AI-fueled organization unless you can elevate that and then start to, it's kind of normally from being silo-driven to where you actually start to go, actually, this is an enterprise-wide capability. It needs to be linked to strategy, that we start to see the cross-pollination of those use cases. You start to like showcase one part to a customer lens approach of an AI tool, but then go, what does that mean from an operational perspective in terms of cost? What does it mean from a risk and compliance perspective? You can start to scale that. And so I think, you know, organizations that haven't been born in the cloud, like your Netflix, your Spotify's, et cetera, your Ubers, their journey is a little bit more challenging because they're not born AI fueled the way they are, but there are logical ways to quickly, you know, rise up that maturity curve, but you do have to take an enterprise-wide approach.
What's the Kel, you need to share with this audience, what's that one line that one of our clients, the best quote ever to summarize this?
Yeah, so I was doing a lab around, you know, your maturity on the AI fueled curve around where you're at, and this participant in one of my labs came up. He said, you know, Kelly, there's a reason that God created the world in 7 days, and it's because there was no legacy systems. And it's actually not wrong when you think about, like, you know, incumbent organizations versus, you know, your examples. But there are fantastic examples of existing organizations that, you know, everyone goes, give me an example that's not Spotify, Netflix, etc. If you look at the work, for example, Domino's are doing, it is like leading the charge in terms of how they're using AI across their entire business to innovate, to deliver better pizzas more quickly, to preempt your ordering before you've even ordered. Like, they're doing a whole lot of really interesting stuff as an organization that wasn't born in the cloud. So it can be done.
There's already a question in the Q&A from Jess, and it says, if you could paint a picture of what an optimal AI-fueled organization looks like, what would it be? What teams are working cross-functionally? How is AI helping?
Yeah, do you want to take that one
to Alon?
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to take that one. I think probably the first thing I'd say, when you talk about cross-functional, that to me is the most important piece. It's really easy to get really excited about cool things you can do with AI. It's really easy to get excited about cool things you can do for your customers, but unless you're doing it together, you just end up with a lot of confusion and a lot of mess. You know, so to pick on, you know, Kelly's example with Domino's, and hopefully don't get into like a religious pizza war, but there's something different you can create, right? Like, pizza is not known for innovation, right? It's a product that existed for a long time. But then if you think about it, well, you know, how do we enhance the customer experience? How do we give them a bit more certainty, maybe a bit, you know, a degree of novelty, right? Because it's a highly competitive market. I don't think you'd come up with the ideas that they came up with if you just had, you know, one person working one silo and one person working another, right? You're trying to create things that didn't exist before, and you have to start with a deep understanding of the customer, but you also have to start with a deep understanding of what you want to do with the tech. And that only works when it's cross-functional. I think that's also a way of starting to break down the legacy problem that Kelly was describing as well, because you can't clean sheet everything. You can't, you know, magic away your legacy tech stack, but you can eat away at like one piece at a time. And so if you're quite targeted and thoughtful and you've got the right mix of skills in that team, then you're able to start to, you know, take a bite at a time and actually start to, you know, enhance the bits of the stack that are most important as you go into the new world. So to me, that becomes the most important part. There is a lot more that sits around it, but that would be number one in my mind. So,
Kel, you do a lot of work in the AI space, and you've been doing it for near on a decade, not to show your age, sorry about that. But what are some critical steps that organizations could adopt to move up that curve? Because I know that you typically talk about it on a 5-point maturity scale. How does one go from, say, a 2 to a 3? What are some of those foundational elements that they should be considering?
Yeah, look, and it's really interesting, right? So like when you look at the organizations that are nailing their AI or even just their insights journey in general, it's normally not the technology or the data. Like, data is always a barrier. Obviously, there's, you know, a whole lot of work that goes into getting your data right and things like that. Data is what fuels AI, but the biggest reasons, like, you can have those data foundations right, and we still see a huge amount of organizations really struggle to become AI fueled or to really transform their organizations, even though they've invested in those foundations. And the reasons are, you know, we do a lot of research in this, and it's not surprising to me that our research finds exactly what I see day to day in clients every day. And that is, there's kind of 4 key areas that I see that, you know, make or break you being able to get mature in this. And the first is, do you have executive sponsorship and leadership around it? Do you have a culture? And I talk about this a lot, is that you see a lot of CEOs stand up on stages and say, data is so important, AI is so important to where we're going. But you talk about a leadership shadow that a leader casts, and it needs to be more dimensional than just what you say. It has to be what you prioritize, how you act, where you invest. And so often it's the words are there, but it's done more as a kind of, you know, getting the culture up, but it needs to be more than that. So having leaders who actually commit to it, who, you know, question their leaders and their teams when they're not using data or AI in their tools. Why not? Have you thought about using this? Tell me why not. So that's really important to drive that culture around it. The second thing is picking the right use cases. So, you know, tech, data, AI teams, and, you know, we're all being part of them, love to build really complex, interesting problems, but maybe not aligned to strategic value. And so really, you know, I would always say to any organization, the executives or the leadership or the business owner should really be driving what are the wicked problems to solve, and then working with technical teams to actually figure out how do you solve those. And that then leads to the next barrier, is how do you get the right operating model, the right structures for technical and non-technical people to actually come together and work in new ways to solve these problems. And we're seeing a real shift towards product owners of AI solutions being in the business and owning that and actually making sure it's delivering value, and a lot more agile delivery to test and learn and iterate on that. And then I think the final thing is, even if you have the most amazing and you take the last 2 examples we saw, if we had the most amazing, you know, AI, you know, food assessment tool that James just talked about, and Sean's amazing digital twin, if no one actually used them and changed the way that they worked or redesigned operational management around the command center, around that solution, that's a fail too. So you'll never become AI fueled if you're just sort of putting these solutions in and thinking the organization is going to change. The hard work is around unlocking new ways of working, getting people to augment their current, you know, intelligence with these artificial intelligence technologies as an augmented intelligence tool. But it's got to feel like, to the last point, and we saw this beautifully with the last 2 examples, about a tool that just makes people's lives easier at work, the same way that Google navigating to a destination, I don't think of it as an AI algorithm. I just think about it as something that makes my navigation experience a lot more seamless. I don't worry about, you know, I don't think about, oh my God, it's taking over my job as a navigation to that destination. I just think around, it's a tool and it feels like a tool. And I think that's where AI is going. So it's not so much what we saw 5 years ago, where data scientists have very complex models that live in Excel spreadsheets and things like that. Now they're actually user experience tools that you don't even want to talk about them as AI.
And it's so true. I would say that AI is so pervasive in our personal lives. And I'm just like hoping that the true can also be true for our professional lives. And I do think we're definitely seeing a movement, especially off the back of the noise around generative AI. One for you, Alon, is you recently released a book on the role of AI in driving business model. Here's just a little plug. Sorry, absolutely not an influencer here. What's the key takeaway? I feel like I'm in Oprah's book club at the moment.
Oh boy, if it was an Oprah's book club, things have gone off track in Oprahland. No, look, it was an interesting exercise. Firstly, I never thought I'd be authoring anything, and it felt like getting schooled to go back and work with some fantastic researchers at Melbourne Uni to do the research, to understand, you know, how do we want to assess what it takes to transform using these kinds of technologies, but using them as enablers of business model transformation. So you're really fundamentally altering the way that you do things, and then doing it in kind of an academically rigorous way. So it's an interesting experience, and there's a lot to cover, but if I had to kind of distill it into a couple of things, it wouldn't be fundamentally different from, you know, some of what Kelly's just described, right? You've got to start with customer value. What are we going to create that's going to be different from what exists today? Something that is a wicked problem it creates value for people, it's a new service, or it's, you know, economically scalable in a way that just wasn't possible before. And then it becomes a business model opportunity. It's not a tech thing that sits off in the side and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We'll hear about it in 12, 18, 36 months, whatever it is, right? It has to be something that you've got that buy-in, that proactive leadership, and you're working towards an outcome that fundamentally positions your business in a very different way. The other thing I'd suggest, you know, the best examples we have, and this is all looking at incumbent organizations. This is not necessarily Google-sized businesses. This is your typical ASX 200 organization and some public sector organizations. It all starts with curiosity and pragmatism, right? So it's not about, you know, buzzwords and the latest hype tech about cool things that you can do. It's just realizing that with AI, we're living in a very, very different world. And that has taken away a lot of constraints that used to exist. And therefore, your traditional sources of value are quite different. And we can think quite differently about the way that we invest into the future and keep building our business. So to your comment around, you know, generative AI, I think it's a fantastic example where, you know, previously you think, oh my God, you know, to create content, to do personalization, for example, that was incredibly expensive. It was incredibly difficult. And now all of a sudden you can do that at a unit cost that is just almost irrelevant in most businesses. And you can tailor it so you can have, you know, messaging to customers that is in the tone of their favorite celebrity or some other kind of, you know, nuance that just wasn't possible before that. That's fundamentally different. And so we're living in a very different world, and just, you know, having comfort with the discomfort is also quite an important aspect as well.
So do you think business model change then is something clients see related to AI, or do they just think of AI as a capability to run their existing business more effectively?
I think we're in a journey, and I think it'd be interesting to get a couple of different perspectives from the sorts of people who are on this call as well, because for a long time it was all about, you know, show me your use case library. And we normally think about these as the horizontals. They're the things that exist in every organization. So everyone's got a finance function, and it could be run a bit more effectively using AI. Same goes for HR and all the other kind of, you know, key corporate functions that exist everywhere. And so people always wanted to look at your use case libraries about the best things you can do in terms of predicting, you know, employee attrition or something like that. And to me, that is important, absolutely important. But, you know, as Kel was describing at the very beginning, that's at that first step of that maturity. So we're digitizing some things, getting a little bit more insight than we would have had before. But that's not the same as working on the verticals that are really unique in the sectors that we play in, and they're quite unique to what this organization can do. And you're not going to find that in a use case library. So the example that James was giving around Compass before, I'd be really confident to say that that doesn't exist. That's not a thing that you could have just said, oh, you know, I'm going to, you know, flick open a book or a website and say, oh, you know, tell me about, you know, food in aged care homes and how that works, right? That takes first principles thinking, and that's where people have started to move now. I think there has been this realization that to really fundamentally compete in a world of AI, not only do you need to have some of the more, you know, fundamental horizontal use cases, but you need to do something that is unique to your business model and the advantages that you have combined with AI. So it's a bit of a with.
All right, there's a bit of a curveball question. I'm going to put you on the spot, both of you. What is your favorite example of a really cool problem you've seen a business solve using AI? So I guess it's kind of like, what's your favorite AI use case that you've seen? And it doesn't have to be Deloitte.
I love the feel goody kind of one. So like, obviously I've worked with Sean for a long time in the Department of Transport example. So that is like kind of my all-time favorite, but we've already talked about that. And I loved the reason we wanted James to be on this is because it's another really amazingly impactful societal kind of impact feel good use case. But one of my favorites was working in the regulatory space, where working with a regulator, we're trying to predict where there's risk of insolvency, or like, so we did some work with a building regulator for a few years, where we were looking at if we could predict insolvency before it happened in the building sector, we could become more proactive as a regulator instead of, you know, always being reactive and after the impact of it happening, which is quite, you know, economically impactful and also societally impactful in Australia. So able to predict that was awesome, and getting ahead and actually having, like, you know, months to a year of kind of notice of how things were tracking to be able to get in early and not prevent, but, you know, put the right regulations around it to protect the industry was really impactful.
It's really cool. Yours feels a lot more human and meaningful than mine. Mine is more novelty. I love Canva, and I love Canva for a few reasons, partly because it's a disruptor, partly because it's, you know, this great Aussie startup. But I don't know if anyone's seen recently when the generative AI technology came up, they've added a case as you're making your post to go up on social media, whatever it is, you can type in a couple of words, create an image, and it's bespoke to you. And this sounds really petty, but I hate social media marketing. I hate that kind of process of needing to pick what image and, you know, then doubting yourself and overthinking these sorts of things. Then you can get on there and you start typing a couple of words and you create something that is completely unique for whatever obscure thing that you want to put up. And it's an amazing customer experience. And it's this great novel use of some incredibly sophisticated technology, but like you access it with a couple of words and it really differentiates you. So I think that one to me is really cool, but doesn't have the same degree of societal impact that the example Kelly gave did.
I mean, I still love the Domino's one around, you know, you can almost predict every week that Alon's going to order a cheese pizza for his kids on this at this time, and they start cooking it because the wastage of it, they can offer that then to someone else for a cheaper deal, right? Like that's kind of where AI technology is going. It's like that's pretty fun, but yeah, there's a heap of, you know, awesome applications we see every day and just don't think about, you know, in terms of the filters we apply in our Instagram profiles to like, yeah, just, I mean, I still think my favorite example is the search function for cats in, or, you know, I was just like trying to find a photo of my dad's car to send to someone and I just search car and photos like that's, and all the cars I've taken photos of in my photo library come up. Like these are incredible applications. It's now for business to start thinking about what they could do with them, right?
Absolutely. I love searching for cats in my phone, although when it comes up with 3,000, I'm always like, oh, what are the choices I've made to have 3,000 cat photos in my phone? And I'm also very curious if Alon's order is actually a cheese pizza, but that's for another day. All right. Let's talk about something that is like the zeitgeist of the day, and that's generative AI. So, Cal, I would say that generative AI is all the rage. It's on TV programs, it's front and center of everyone's minds. But what are you seeing actually in industry as the types of questions that people are asking about this? Is it use case? Is it what actually is it? Is it how do I embed this into my overarching strategy? What are our people asking?
I think like what we're seeing, and this is, you know, we think about ChatGPT didn't exist before November, right? So this is very, very new, but very fast momentum. Like I've never felt like my head has spun so much. I mean, it's exciting. I feel like it's, you know, the watershed moment for AI. At the moment, most executive leadership teams are just really asking us to help them understand what it is. Get, you know, hands-on with it, understand where the value of it is, understand where the privacy of the data goes, you know, what are the risks with using it, how do I get competitive advantage, I think is a really important discussion point, because essentially, as Alon was alluding to before, like it used to be expensive, so only the really large corporations could use AI. Now anyone can use it. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a big organization or a really small organization, the barrier to entry for using these technologies and the ability for the smaller organizations in some ways is even quicker because they can be more nimble. They don't have all of the like the processes and governance to go through to use it that larger organizations do. So for me, you know, the conversation needs to be more around how do you actually apply this technology to get competitive advantage? And I think it's going to be very much around how you combine the generative AI with your proprietary data sets to be trained and tuned on top of data that others don't have. I can deliver a much more personalized experience to you, Erica, if you're already my customer and I already have that data plus generative AI than Alon does as a competitor that doesn't have that data. So I think, you know, encouraging leadership teams to not just think about the quick wins and getting in there and using it just in its own right, but thinking around how they then actually create new offerings with it, new personalized experiences, not just think of it as an efficiency play. There's that. And then I think the other really interesting one is like the last 5 years of my career have been, you know, helping organizations set up their operating models to become AI fueled or data driven, and, you know, governance around who does what with data. And suddenly you've got like potentially 15,000 different skunkworks popping up with generative AI in your organization that you don't even know about again. And so it's kind of like, I think there's something really interesting in that technology always moves fastest. And then individuals as humans, people, we adopt to that quicker than business does. And business is full of people. So even though your business might not be mature, your people are. And so that's a really interesting conundrum for leaders around generative AI at the moment is how do you like, you might not think it's going on, but it's probably going on everywhere, but your enterprise might not know or be mature enough to use it in the right ways yet. So quickly, like, you know, speed is a luxury. Time is a luxury you don't have with generative AI. And so I think that's a really interesting debate that we're seeing play out at the moment as well.
Yeah, there is a really interesting thing, particularly to the speed comment, in that, you know, the cost of prediction and the cost of structuring unstructured data and things like that, it all plummeted, but then you still had to create content for it. And so, you know, there were a lot of people looking at personalization, but then they're saying, well, we've got to make creative content and we've got to do these things that feed into the prediction algorithms and then deploy that kind of content, but we actually don't have anything to deploy. And so there's this multiplicative effect that we're now seeing where the generative AI tech then overlaps with all the other tech, and it creates something that is really, truly unique that you wouldn't have been able to before. There's a whole lot of research that was done initially out of the US, and then we've replicated it in Australia as well, talking about exponential enterprises and the amount of, you know, forward value creation that gets made by organizations that have adopted these kinds of tech. And it was done before the time of generative AI. But I think it's pretty safe to say that now that this technology exists, it's only going to increase the rate at which that value creation either goes more and more to the organization that's taking advantage of it, so that time dimension is getting even you know, faster than before. And unfortunately, the ones that are kind of sitting on the sidelines waiting for other people to innovate, they're going to have more of that value taken out.
Now, here's another question for generative AI. Is there a fluency element here, Cal? Because I would say that with generative AI, people are like, I need to know about it. But a lot of people don't know what AI is. Do you think that fluency is should be front and center of people's minds right now as we go on this journey?
I mean, you and I have been on this journey for years. We thought we'd go out and help clients build AI strategies as part of their business strategy 2-3 years ago. And it just was, we hit a wall when people, you know, were like, can you just explain to me what AI even is? And it's such a nebulous term, right? It's because it's an umbrella term for a heap of different technologies that, you know, simulate human intelligence in some form. It's when you combine them together. So if we look at Netflix recommendations, it's running analytical processing of a whole lot of, you know, data that other people have watched like you. And then it's generating content, and in terms of a recommendation thing, they're two different technologies that are bundled together. It's called AI, but then it's the same algorithms that in autonomous vehicles, taking in all that computer vision, analyzing it, and then automating a, you know, brake. That's AI, but it's a different combination of technologies. And so it becomes very confusing what AI is. And, you know, most executives, AI was not a discussion for them when they first went into their jobs, and now it's here. So I think we spend a lot of time with executive teams building AI fluency. What are these technologies? Where can they deliver value? What are the risks you need to think about? Not to be coders, not to be able to actually talk to what type of neural networks, you know, don't even go there, but it's more around, you know, what skills can it simulate? You know, and generative is just one of them. It can generate content in the same way a human can, whether that's an image, whether it's audio, whether it's code, whether it's 3D drawings. Like, so I think understanding, you know, that's the first point that every organization should focus on, and the leaders, because I go back to that connection point earlier around leaders are so important in this organization, being, you know, driving that journey, driving the narrative, driving the priorities around these investments in a responsible way. If you don't understand that as a leader, you are going to be challenged, which is, I guess, why we're so excited about the next section with Kai and Sandra. Excuse me.
Absolutely. I love our friends at the University of Sydney. Alon, I'm going to throw you the techie one that's in the question. So what is the current discussion regarding cybersecurity, since this is so data reliant? Are they playing catch up or in sync with the development? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, that's a tricky one. And It's tricky for a family reason because my brother's a cybersecurity expert, so he's going to end up making fun of me for the Luddite answer that I give. Look, it's an interesting problem. We've seen some pretty big breaches, and that's obviously a massive concern. And not to like oversimplify this, but I think a lot of the cybersecurity risk that we see tend to be associated with legacy stacks, legacy systems, and often that's also people managing and trying to manage their own security infrastructure, et cetera, which is an incredibly hard task, right? So I think one point I'd say is understanding where the threats are being exploited is important. And it's not necessarily in some of these areas where people are investing into, because once you've moved onto the cloud and you're in a kind of best practice environment, there are a whole lot of threats that get taken care of by the vendor who patches things up to date and makes certain that it's got all the different cybersecurity mechanisms that you need to have. So there's one aspect there where I think a lot of fear is justifiably being felt by a lot of people because the impact of cybersecurity events is very, very high. I just think you need to deal with it in a very structured way because there's a way to protect your business that doesn't stop you from innovating. And then that's kind of the other aspect I'd say, like, you need to be brave and you need to be quite proactive to continue to move forward, because even though these things do happen and they are really serious events that need to be thought through carefully, and there's the proactive investment aspect, that doesn't mean that you can then put off innovating your organization. You could put all of your time and effort into cybersecurity and dealing with lots of different threats. And one way of dealing with that is basically, shutter the blinds, but you'll basically see your existing organization recede into the night. And that's the thing that, we need to, I guess, have two concurrent thoughts in our heads as business leaders, right? Like you need to make certain that you're, stewarding the organization, the tech environment, and more often than not, the non-tech areas where people are injecting into an organization, because there's lots of different ways that people have threats into organizations. But on the flip side, you can't stop. You have to continue innovating, and there's no way that you can only do one thing as an organization these days. It's just far too complex a business landscape.
And there's a follow-on question, I think, in a similar vein in the Q&A, and it's around big concerns right now that are mostly around security of organization and personal data. How do you see AI perhaps preventing some of the bad actors out there, or even predicting if organizations are at risk? So I think that's that AI to fight AI angle, if you wanted to give that a go, Cal.
No, I feel like Alon's got something on the tip of his tongue. You go.
It's a really interesting one, right? So there's lots of different ways to talk through this one, right? Like there's AI technology that creates deep fakes, and then there's AI technology that is being used to detect deep fakes. And it's like this constant spy versus spy novel. If anyone remembers those comic books, or if I'm getting a bit too... Oh, there you go. Kel gets it.
But they're Mad magazine.
Just nod. Yeah. Oh, this is awful. Okay. But it is this constant process where, there's an innovation in one area and, eyes wide open, there's some great stuff that gets used. And then there's also these very dodgy adversarial things. And I think, generative AI, there's a couple of great examples of, content creation and misinformation where you can see how it's going to get misused. I think we're all getting a little bit cynical in the world, and you can see how that'll happen. But in parallel, there is some great innovation in terms of then predicting and assessing, is this the right content? Is this actually nefarious? How does that work? Again, you can't just kind of park yourself on the sideline. And so there's really interesting work being done there. But I think this is where the leading edge is so advanced that you need to partner with third parties to be across the innovations in this technology, because no one company is going to have enough firepower to really keep up with this. It's just incredibly sophisticated what's being done out there.
Oh, and just the investment that companies are putting into it, right? And it's the same with large language models at the moment. Everyone's like, oh, you're going to build a large language model. I'm like, there's so much money that goes into doing that, right? And so it's how you actually take these partners that you work with in the large language model space, and you build your models and tune them using your own instance to have that safe and secure kind of version of that model and tool. So I think that's the way it's going to go. But, you know, security is always, to Alon's point, it's always a consideration. It's been a consideration when the internet happened. It's been, you know, consideration with mobile phones. It's, you know, all of these technology advancements are not without their risks, but they're also, again, you know, I'm an optimist around technology risks have always been able to be managed for the most part. And so I don't think, to Alon's point, you don't want to stop driving that innovation because of the risks. There are a lot of good frameworks out there, including them put out by the Australian government around how to build AI in a responsible and trustworthy way. And there's, you know, every day there's, you know, more and more tools that can help you understand the explainability of models, the you know, the completeness of your data, the robustness of your predictions. So there are people out there, and, you know, encourage everyone to get advice in terms of how to do this responsibly and put the right guide rails, because I think you'll find that the investment in getting the right advice around you and getting running with it, as opposed to just waiting, is probably also a risk in its own right.
All right. We're getting too risky. We're getting too big, scary. I'm going to 180
Give me
you
a
guys.
fun one. Yeah.
All right, okay, so here's a nebulous one. What's your biggest hope for AI in Australia? Let's start with you, Kel.
My biggest hope for AI in Australia is that we actually, you know, create an innovation economy around it. We are a small country that has a lot of innovation in its gene pool, and we really can build and show to the rest of the world what AI could do in terms of, and particularly I'm passionate, you know, I do a lot of work in public sector. I really believe that, you know, my biggest concern would be that public sector gets too concerned about it and doesn't actually embrace it, because it has so much potential given some of the challenges we're facing in climate change, in hospital demand and healthcare demand and services at the moment, in terms of citizen experience and, you know, servicing complex populations and vulnerable populations that have data in every agency, how you craft, you know. So I hope that public sector in Australia kind of really lead the way on this in a responsible way. It would be my hope. And that my second hope, because I'm just going to sneak a second one in, is that we don't become complacent about AI, because for our economic advantage, if we don't, as organisations in Australia, start to think around the roles that AI, and it needs, you know, it does need the startups, it does need the universities, but it also needs the big corporations and government to start showing the way to build an economy around AI, because they will create the most jobs around it. And if we don't, we will see, you know, Silicon Valley, other, you know, tech hubs around the world start to develop these solutions and come in and offer them in our country. And like Uber disrupted, we'll see this happening more and more. And we want to have jobs in AI, solutions in AI built in Australia for Australia, so we can drive an economy around it.
And what's your biggest hope?
We're at a Goldilocks. So we're at a bit of a Goldilocks size, right? Like the market is big enough and sophisticated enough that you can actually do some incredible things. And I think there's a lot of inspiration we've taken from not only the Canvas and Atlassians of the world, but there are some great examples of incumbents that have been able to innovate. And we need to take a bit of inspiration for that and then adapt it into the patterns that exist in all those different sectors. Like we've got that size where, you know, it's not the same scale as the US, but it's big enough to justify the return on the investment that needs to be made in order to drive those innovations. And, you know, small enough that it's not overly bureaucratic and you know, they have the size disadvantages that also happen sometimes.
All right, guys, let's finish up with 2 questions, which are always fun. So what is your podcast/book recommendation for someone wanting to boost their AI fluency? I think I might know what Alon's is already off the bat, but and that might be business model transformation. No.
No.
All right, Alon, what is your podcast or book recommendation for someone wanting to boost their fluency in this space?
I'm addicted to Pivot by Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, if anyone's heard that one. They're both hilarious, but there's a really nice combination. So, you know, Kara comes at it from a position of what is this creating for a customer and what is the kind of the meaningful impact of the different technologies that are coming out, but no buzzwords, right? It's just really simplified, pragmatic view of the world. And then Scott from a kind of finance view of the world, how do people actually monetize these things? And it's interesting because as you listen to it, you can see what things are going to be very innovative, but not necessarily very profitable. They're just going to become commodities pretty quickly versus what things actually have lasting advantage. And so you got a real good kind of diverse set of viewpoints without getting particularly technical. So I'm a big fan. And also I like dad jokes.
For me, I think the book, so one of our colleagues, Nitin Mittal, has just written a book called All In on AI with Davenport. This guy, very good. Definitely from an enterprise view of like, you know, what should businesses be thinking about? It's quite a good one. In terms of podcasts, like I'm actually going to plug the Unlearn project, which is by Kai and Sandra, who are about to join us as our guests. It's the thing I love about it is their fascination with the fact that the world is changing and all of our, you know, common sense logic that we used as running businesses has to be unlearned. So whether they're talking about unlearning for AI or blockchain or new technologies, or even what, you know, the very nature of retirement means in Australia these days, like they've just got the most amazing little like things that make you think for a business around technology and changes in society on a, you know, fairly regular basis. I really enjoy their banter, and their chemistry together is very good. So on that note, I should probably introduce them. Is that what I'm meant to do now?
No, you still have one question.
Okay, one question.
The one question is, okay, if you could leave the audience with one word, and I mean this, let's not be consult, one word to describe what AI means to business today and tomorrow, what would it be? One word.
Opportunity.
Yeah, I was going to say opportunity, and this is a bit more brutal, but it's just relevance. Yeah, to stay relevant, you need to be thinking about this. No business is sitting there today going, oh yeah, you know, the internet's just going to be a hype. I just might sit back and watch that one play out for a couple of years. Yeah,
that's very, very true.
AI is here, and this is its moment, and there's been a lot of hype for a lot of years, but we are seeing with generative AI, it is real, it is tangible, you can touch it, you can see the benefits. We've never seen it so accessible. This is AI's moment. You need to be thinking about it.
It's a really good way to end. Thank you both for joining me on this panel, and thank you for sticking to the one word of opportunity and relevance and not going on a PowerPoint spree. That was great, guys.